In the unforgiving dust of the American West, courage wasn't measured by the gun you carried, but by the pain you were willing to endure for another. In the raw, cruel town of Redemption, Gulch, one woman was about to prove it. She was a stranger with nothing to her name, but a quiet dignity the townsfolk mistook for weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. This is the story of how a single, selfless act of defiance in the face of brutality brought a town to its knees. Why would a lone woman from the East trade her own skin for that of a native child? And why, the very next morning, would the 5 most feared men in the territory kneel at her feet? Stay with me and uncover the truth behind the legend. The town of Redemption Gulch was a lie held together by thirst and fear. Thirst for gold that had long since dwindled to a trickle in the nearby creek, and fear of the man who owned the only reliable well, Bartholomew Thorne. His name was a heavy stone in the mouth of every man, woman, and child in the settlement. He owned the mercantile, the saloon, the livery, and through them the lives of everyone who lived under the oppressive Colorado sun. Into this crucible walked Abigail Hayes in the late summer of 1878. She was not a gunslinger, nor a saloon girl, nor a homesteader's weathered wife. She was a ghost from another world, a former governess from Philadelphia, with eyes the color of a placid lake and a spine made of quiet, unyielding steel. Her father, a doctor, had passed a few months prior, leaving her with a modest inheritance that was quickly consumed by the journey west. She had come seeking not fortune, but anonymity, a place where the shadow of a family scandal back east could not reach her. She'd found work as a seamstress, her fine motor skills and keen eye a small, respectable island in a sea of rough hands and rougher manners. She lived in a small room above the bakery, the scent of fresh bread, a constant, gentle comfort against the town's prevailing odors of whiskey sweat and manure. From her window, she watched the rhythm of Redemption Gulch. She saw the weary miners, the nervous homesteaders, the swaggering ranch hands, and she saw the natives from the nearby Ute encampment who came to town to trade their faces, impassive masks, against the thinly veiled contempt they received. Among them was a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, named Nita. She had wide, curious eyes and moved with the silent grace of a deer. Nita would sometimes linger by the bakery, and Abigail, remembering the lonely children she'd once cared for, would slip her a day-old biscuit. They never spoke much. A shared smile, a quiet thank you from the girl, and a nod from Abigail were the extent of their bond. It was a fragile connection, but in a place like Redemption Gulch, any kindness was a radical act. The inciting incident, as they always are, was small and ugly. One sweltering Tuesday afternoon, a cry went up from Thorne's mercantile. Bartholomew Thorne himself, a man built like a barrel, with a face perpetually flushed with rage and cheap whiskey, dragged Nita out by her thin arm. In his other hand he held a small sterling silver locket. Thieving savage, he bellowed his voice, carrying across the dusty main street. Caught her red-handed, trying to lift this from the jewelry case, Nita's eyes were wide with terror. "No, I did not," she cried, her voice thin and reedy. A crowd gathered, instantly drawn by the promise of drama. They were vultures in homespun cotton and worn denim. Abigail, hearing the commotion from her room, felt a cold dread snake up her spine. She hurried downstairs, pushing her way to the edge of the circle. I saw her a woman named Martha, known for her vicious gossip, chimed in. Her eyes were glued to it all morning. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine had been bought and paid for by Thorne years ago, ambled over. He didn't look at Nita. He looked at Thorne. "What's the trouble, Bartholomew? The trouble is that we allow these heathens to walk our streets, Thorn spat, shaking the locket for emphasis. They learn to steal before they learn to talk. This one needs a lesson for all her kind to see. Nita was sobbing now, her small body trembling. It is not true, I was only looking, Thorn sneered. Looking? Well, you'll get a good look at the whipping post. 10 lashes. That's the price for thievery in my town. Sheriff Brody nodded slowly. That's the law. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a cruel sentence for a child, but Nita was a native child. In the eyes of most, she was less than. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the faces in the crowd, some eager, some nervous, but all silent. Complicit. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a constant refrain from her childhood. Silence in the face of cruelty is the first betrayal of your own soul. She looked at Nita, small and terrified, and at Thorn, a monument to petty tyranny. The world seemed to narrow to that single awful point in time. The scandal she'd fled, the life she'd lost, it all seemed insignificant compared to the monstrous injustice about to unfold. Sheriff Brody started to untie a rope from his saddle. Thorn shoved Nita toward the thick wooden post in the center of town, a permanent fixture of his brand of justice. And that is when Abigail Hayes moved. Abigail didn't run. She walked. She moved with a deliberate calm that parted the crowd like a ship's prow through water. Every eye turned to her, this quiet seamstress, in her simple grey dress, now smudged with the ever-present red dust. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. She stopped directly in front of Thorn, placing herself between the furious man and the weeping child. "Stop," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring and the heat with crystalline clarity. Thorn blinked, his rage momentarily replaced by disbelief. "Get out of the way, Miss Hayes. This ain't your concern. An injustice to a child is everyone's concern, Mr. Thorn," she replied, her gaze unwavering. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. No one spoke to Bartholomew Thorn that way. Sheriff Brody paused the rope, limp in his hand. Thorn's face darkened, the flush deepening to a dangerous purple. "She's a thief. The law says she gets the lash." "What proof do you have?" Abigail challenged. "Beyond your own word, and that of a known gossip, did anyone else see her take it?" Silence. Martha, the gossiping woman, flushed and looked at her shoes. The crowd shuffled. They had seen nothing but a powerful man making an accusation. "My word is proof enough in this town," Thorn snarled, taking a step closer. He was a foot taller than her and twice as wide. "Now I'll say it one last time. Move." Abigail stood her ground. She glanced back at Nita, who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror. She then looked back at Thorn, her decision hardening into something unbreakable. "No," she said simply. Thorn's patience, always a shallow reservoir, evaporated completely. "Fine, you want to stand for the savage, you can take her punishment. Sheriff, the law is the law. 10 lashes." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was a line that had never been crossed. Whipping a native was one thing. A white woman, a lady from the East, was another entirely. Sheriff Brody looked horrified. "Bartholomew, you can't. She's obstructing justice." Thorn roared his authority, now directly challenged. He saw the hesitation in the crowd, the flicker of doubt. He knew he had to crush it. She interferes, she takes the penalty. That's the way it is. Tie her to the post. For a moment, no one moved. The world held its breath. Abigail closed her eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned. She walked to the whipping post, her back straight, her movements graceful. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Nita. She placed her hands on the rough, splintered wood. It was an act of such profound, unexpected defiance that it stunned the town into paralysis. Sheriff Brodie, pale and sweating, looked from Thorne's furious face to Abigail's calm back. He was a weak man, but Thorne's will was stronger than his conscience. With trembling hands, he took Abigail's wrists and tied them to the post. Abigail flinched at the bite of the rope, but made no sound. She could hear Nita's ragged sobs behind her. Thorne ripped the bullwhip from Brodie's saddle. He was going to do it himself. He wanted to make the point. This is what happens when you challenge the order of things in Redemption Gulch, he bellowed to the silent town. The first lash was a line of pure fire across her back. Abigail's body jerked, a strangled cry torn from her throat. The pain was blinding, white-hot, and absolute. It seared through the fabric of her dress and into her very being. The crowd winced as one. The second lash fell. Abigail bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She focused on the grain of the wood under her fingers, on the scent of the bakery, on anything but the agony that was consuming her. She would not scream. She would not give him the satisfaction. 1. She counted internally, her mind clinging to the numbers as a raft in a sea of pain. 2. She felt Nita's small hand touch her leg, a fleeting, desperate gesture of connection. 3. The world began to swim in a haze of red. Her father's face, the scandal, a broken engagement, the whispers. Why she had run west. All of it burned away in the fire on her back. 4. A low murmur of protest started in the crowd, but it was weak, easily cowed. 5. Halfway, her knees buckled, but the ropes held her up. She hung there a sacrifice to one man's ego. She heard a man shout, "That's enough, Thorne!" It was Mr. Abernathy the baker, a kind man who had always been pleasant to her. Thorne turned, whip in hand. "Anyone else want to take her place?" Silence fell again, thick and ashamed. 6, 7, 8. Each blow was a fresh wave of nausea and agony. Her consciousness was fraying the edges of her vision, turning dark. She was only vaguely aware of the world outside the bubble of her suffering. 9. She thought she heard the distant thunder of hoofbeats, but it was probably just the blood pounding in her ears. The 10th lash. It was delivered with a final, brutal flourish. The world went black. As Abigail sagged against the ropes unconscious, the last thing she registered was the sound of Nita being pulled away to safety by the baker's wife, and the unmistakable, rapidly approaching thunder of many horses riding hard for town. 30 miles north of Redemption Gulch, nestled in a hidden valley carved by the Serpentine River, was a ranch that didn't appear on any map. It was a place spoken of in whispers, a place of myth as much as reality. This was the home of the Callahan brothers. They were not a myth. They were 5 men forged from the granite of the mountains and the fire of injustice. Their father, a grizzled Irish trapper named Finn Callahan, had fallen in love with a Ute woman named Morning Song. Their union was a scandal to the white settlers and a complication for the Ute, but it was a bond of genuine love. They had 5 sons before Morning Song was taken by a fever when the youngest was just a boy. Finn raised them himself, teaching them how to read from a tattered Bible, how to shoot straight, how to track, and how to trust no one but each other. But it was their mother who gave them their other half, a deep connection to the land, an understanding of its secrets, and an unshakable loyalty to their maternal kin. And they had one full-blooded Ute sister, born to Morning Song from a previous union before she met Finn Nita. They were fiercely, terrifyingly protective of her. After Finn's death, the brothers kept to their valley, raising the best horses in the territory and guarding their family with a quiet lethality. Caleb Callahan was the eldest, the patriarch. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's unnervingly calm eyes. He was the thinker, the strategist, the one whose silence was heavier than any man's threat. Isaac was the second, the hothead. He was built like a bull with a temper to match. He was the first to a fight, and the last to back down his loyalty, a raging fire. Silas, the middle brother, was the quietest. He spent more time in the wilderness than in the ranch house, moving through the trees like a ghost. He was the tracker, the hunter, his senses honed to a preternatural sharpness. He was the most like their mother. Levi was the charmer, the face of the operation. He was the one who went into towns to sell their horses and buy supplies. His easy smile and quick wit, a deceptive mask for the steel beneath. And Jonah the youngest. He was just 19 with a gentler nature than his brothers, but with the same core of Callahan iron. He was the one who cared most for Nita, who taught her games and carved her small wooden animals. They were in the middle of breaking a wild mustang when one of their Ute cousins, a young man named Black Hawk, rode into their valley as if the devil himself were on his heels. He slid from his lathered horse, breathing hard. "Nita," he gasped. In town. Thorn accused her of stealing. Isaac dropped the rope he was holding his face instantly. A thundercloud. He touched her. They were going to whip her, Black Hawk said, and the air in the valley grew cold. Caleb's face was unreadable, carved from stone. He looked at Silas, who was already glancing at the sun, calculating the time. "Tell me everything," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. Black Hawk recounted the scene in the town square, ending with the unbelievable part. And then the white woman, the seamstress, she stepped in front. She told Thorn to stop. He whipped her instead, all 10 lashes. She took them for Nita. The 5 brothers stood frozen. This was a variable they could never have predicted. They had plans for what to do if Thorn ever laid a hand on Nita. They were violent, simple plans. But this, a stranger, a white woman, sacrificing herself for their sister. It was an act of courage so profound it defied their understanding of the world they lived in. Isaac swore a low, vicious sound. "She's still our blood. We ride now. We burn that town to the ground." "No," Caleb said, his voice cutting through Isaac's rage. The single word silenced him. Caleb turned to Black Hawk. "Where is Nita now safe? The baker's wife took her in. They are hiding her." "The woman, Miss Hayes." "I don't know. She fell. They cut her down. The baker and the doc took her." Caleb nodded, processing. His mind was a whirlwind, but his face was a mask of perfect calm. Burning the town was easy. Vengeance was easy. But this woman's sacrifice demanded more than that. It demanded a different kind of response. An act of such magnitude could not be repaid with simple violence. It had changed the nature of the debt. Isaac Levi saddled the 5 best, not the fastest, the strongest. "The ones that look like thunder," Caleb commanded. "Silas, get our good rifles from the house. Jonah, fill the canteens." "What's the plan?" Caleb Levi asked, his charming demeanor gone replaced by a grim seriousness. Caleb looked toward the south in the direction of Redemption Gulch. A cold, hard light entered his eyes. Thorn wanted to make a lesson of Nita. He wanted to show the town what power looks like. "Tomorrow we will show them." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his brothers. "We will show them what loyalty looks like, and we will show them what it means to be in the debt of the Callahan brothers. Get the horses. We ride at dawn." There was no more talk of burning the town. Caleb's word was law. They moved with a silent, deadly purpose. The Mustang stood forgotten in the corral. A far more important storm was gathering. The morning after the whipping, a sick, tense silence hung over Redemption Gulch. The sun rose into a hazy sky, casting long, distorted shadows down the main street. Doors stayed shut. Windows remained curtained. The town was holding its collective breath, nursing a hangover of shame and fear. Everyone knew something had been broken the day before, something far more important than the skin on Abigail Hayes's back. Bartholomew Thorne stood on the porch of his mercantile, sipping his morning coffee. He projected an air of smug satisfaction, but a keen observer would have seen the tightness around his eyes. He'd won the battle of wills, but the victory felt hollow. The town's silence was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of revulsion. He'd made his point, but he'd also made himself a monster in the eyes of the very people he sought to control. Inside the small clinic of Dr. Marcus, a weary, kind-faced man in his late 50s, Abigail drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Her back was a landscape of pain, meticulously cleaned and bandaged by the doctor, who muttered curses at Thorne under his breath the entire time. The baker's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, sat by her bedside, dabbing her forehead with a cool cloth. "She's a fighter, this one," Dr. Marcus said, checking his work. The lashes were deep. He didn't hold back. It's a miracle no infection has set in yet. Abigail's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was Mrs. Abernathy's worried face. "Nita," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "She's safe, dear," the woman soothed. "Safe with me and my husband. Don't you worry about a thing." A tear of relief slipped from the corner of Abigail's eye, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The pain was immense, a constant throbbing fire, but knowing the child was safe made it bearable. She tried to sit up, a gasp of agony stopping her. "Easy now, Miss Hayes," Dr. Marcus cautioned. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. You need to rest." But Abigail shook her head slightly. "I can't stay here. I'll bring trouble to you." "Let trouble come," the doctor said grimly. "After yesterday, I think this town has it coming." It was then that they heard it. A sound that started as a low rhythmic vibration felt more than heard. It grew, steadily resolving itself into the unmistakable sound of shod hooves on hard, packed earth. But this was not the scattered clatter of a lone rider or a passing buckboard. This was the sound of power, measured, inexorable. The few people who were on the street froze, heads turned toward the north end of town. Thorne on his porch narrowed his eyes. They came over the rise, 5 abreast, blocking the sun. The Callahan brothers. They were not riding fast. They moved at a slow, deliberate walk, and the effect was terrifying. They rode horses that were a head taller than any in town, great black and bay beasts that seemed carved from the same mountain rock as their riders. The brothers themselves were a vision of grim purpose. Dressed in dark, durable clothes with rifles sheathed in their saddle scabbards and Colts strapped to their hips, they looked like vengeful spirits risen from the earth. Caleb was in the center, his face a granite mask. To his sides were Isaac and Levi, their expressions equally hard. On the wings were Silas, his eyes scanning everything, and Jonah, his youthful face set in a man's grimace. The town seemed to shrink as they advanced. Sheriff Brody, who had just stepped out of his office, saw them and actually took a step back inside his hand, hovering near his gun before he clearly thought better of it. Thorne's smugness finally shattered, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He knew who they were. He knew Nita was their kin. He had gambled they wouldn't dare to retaliate so openly. He was beginning to realize he had miscalculated badly. The brothers rode to the center of town and stopped their horses, forming a perfect, intimidating line. They didn't dismount. They simply sat surveying the town with cold, dispassionate eyes. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in the dust. Then Caleb's gaze found Dr. Marcus's clinic. He nudged his horse forward the others following in tight formation. They stopped in front of the small building. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy was pale. "It's the Callahans," she whispered, her voice trembling. Abigail, weak as she was, pushed herself up, ignoring the searing pain. "Help me stand," she commanded. "But dear, you can't. Help me." Abigail insisted, her voice full of that same quiet steel from the day before. Supported by the doctor and Mrs. Abernathy, wincing with every agonizing movement, Abigail stood. She shuffled to the doorway of the clinic, blinking in the bright morning light. She was a wreck. Her hair was matted, her face was pale and drawn, and she leaned heavily on the doorframe for support. She saw them. 5 titans on horseback, their collective gaze fixed on her. She felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a strange sense of inevitability. Caleb Callahan swung down from his horse, his boots landing softly in the dust. The other 4 brothers followed suit, their movements synchronized and silent. They left their horses standing untethered, knowing they would not move. The town watched, breathless. Thorne watched from his porch, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. Everyone expected a confrontation, a threat, a demand. Instead, the 5 brothers walked forward until they stood a few feet from Abigail. Caleb's eyes, dark and intense, met hers. He saw the pain etched on her face, but he also saw the unbroken spirit behind it. He saw the woman who had done what no one else would. Then, in a single fluid motion that defied belief, he went down on one knee in the dust. One by one, his brothers did the same. Isaac, the fearsome brawler. Levi, the slick talker. Silas, the wild spirit. Jonah, the young man. 5 of the most feared and respected men in the territory, kneeling in the main street of Redemption Gulch. Not to God, not to a governor, but to a battered seamstress leaning in a doorway. The collective shock of the town was a physical thing. It was a silent, massive wave that washed over everyone. Caleb Callahan looked up at Abigail, his voice low but carrying in the profound silence. "Miss Hayes," he said, and the words were a solemn vow. "Yesterday you shielded our blood with your own body. You showed a courage this town has never seen. From this day forward, your enemies are our enemies. Your safety is our vow. This family and everything we own is at your service. You have a debt from us that can never be fully repaid, but we will spend our lives trying. Just tell us what you need." Abigail stared down at the 5 kneeling men, tears welling in her eyes, not of pain, but of something else entirely. In that moment, the power structure of Redemption Gulch did not just crack, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. And on the porch of the Mercantile, Bartholomew Thorne finally understood that the lashes he had delivered the day before had not secured his power. They had signed his death warrant. The image of the 5 Callahan brothers kneeling in the dust was burned into the collective memory of Redemption Gulch. It was an act of theater more powerful than any gunfight, a declaration that rewrote every rule the town had lived by. When the brothers finally stood, they did not wait for a response from the stunned Abigail. Caleb simply gave her a slow, respectful nod, and then they turned, mounted their horses, and rode out of town as silently as they had arrived. They had not come to fight. They had come to make a statement. The effect was immediate and profound. Power in the West was a currency of fear and respect. For years, Thorne had monopolized the fear. In a single morning, the Callahans had claimed all the respect, and in doing so, they had bankrupted him. People started to emerge from their homes, no longer looking at the ground. They gathered in small, murmuring groups, their eyes flicking between the clinic where Abigail was recovering, and Thorne's Mercantile, where the man himself had retreated inside, slamming the door. The spell of his authority was broken. Dr. Marcus and Mrs. Abernathy helped Abigail back to her cot. She was shaking, overwhelmed by the morning's events. Who were they? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Callahans, Doctor. Marcus explained, a new, hopeful light in his eyes. Nita's brothers. Half-brothers, to be precise. They own the valley up by the Serpentine. Keep to themselves, mostly. But cross them, or show loyalty to their family. Well, you've seen what happens. Over the next few days, the shift in power became tangible. Levi Callahan, the charmer, began making regular trips into town. He didn't swagger or threaten. He simply conducted business with a confident smile. He paid for his supplies in solid gold coin, a stark contrast to the credit and scrip Thorne used to keep the townsfolk in his debt. He spoke to Mr. Abernathy, the baker, placing a massive permanent order for bread and supplies for their ranch, paying 3 months in advance. He did the same with the blacksmith. Slowly, methodically, the Callahans were injecting real wealth and independence into a town that had been strangled by Thorne's monopoly. He also visited Dr. Marcus, leaving a heavy purse of coins on the table. For Miss Hayes's care, he said, and for your trouble. If you need anything medicine from Denver New Equipment, you send word. We'll see it done. The most significant change was how people treated Abigail. She was no longer just the quiet seamstress. She was a figure of awe. As she slowly recovered, able to sit in a chair on the clinic's porch for a bit of sun, people would tip their hats. Women would stop and ask if she needed anything. They brought her small gifts, a jar of preserves, a freshly baked pie, a bit of lace. They were offerings of apology for their silence and tokens of respect for her courage. She had become the town's conscience. Thorne, meanwhile, was imploding. He saw his power slipping away, with every friendly knot directed at Abigail, with every gold coin Levi Callahan spent. He tried to reassert his authority, threatening to call in the debts of the blacksmith. The blacksmith, newly flush with Callahan gold, told him to go to hell. When Thorne tried to intimidate a homesteader, the man simply looked him in the eye and said, "I reckon I'll take my chances. I hear the Callahans are honorable men." The name was a shield. The brothers never had to make a threat. Their silent, kneeling promise was enough. About a week after the kneeling, as Abigail was finally strong enough to walk a few steps on her own, Caleb and Silas Callahan returned to town. They didn't come to the clinic. They went to the ransacked abandoned shack on the edge of town where Nita's family had been living. Silas the tracker began to examine the ground around it, his eyes missing nothing. Caleb went inside. An hour later, they came to see Abigail. She received them in Dr. Marcus's study, sitting stiffly in a high-backed chair to protect her still-healing back. Caleb held out his hand. In his palm was the sterling silver locket Thorne had accused Nita of stealing. Abigail gasped. "Where did you find it?" "Silas found it." Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "Buried under a loose floorboard in Nita's shack." Along with this, he opened his other hand. It contained a small tarnished silver button, the kind used on a gentleman's waistcoat. Silas found this caught on a nail near the floorboard. It matches the waistcoat Thorne was wearing last week. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. He planted it. Abigail breathed. He framed her. "Yes," Caleb said, "but the question is why. It's not about a locket. Thorne is a greedy man, not a petty one. There's a bigger reason. It was Abigail, with her outsider's perspective and educated mind, who made the next connection." "The creek," she said, suddenly. Nita's family lived in the shack closest to the bend in the Serpentine Creek, didn't they? Caleb and Silas exchanged a look. "It's the only Ute family that refused to leave that land," Silas said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, like rustling leaves. "Thorne owns the main well. Abigail continued, her mind working quickly. But the creek is free. We're heading into a dry season. The water level is already dropping. If he could get control of the land along that bend, he could dam the creek or divert it. He would control all the water, not just in town, but for miles around. He didn't just want to punish a Ute girl. He wanted to drive her family off their land. Caleb's eyes hardened into chips of obsidian. This was the kind of ruthless, calculated greed he understood. He had the proof Thorn had framed Nita. Now, thanks to Abigail, he had the motive. It was everything he needed. Miss Hayes Caleb said, his voice filled with a new level of respect. You have a sharp mind. My brothers and I, we know how to deal with men like Thorn. But we do it with force. You've shown us a different kind of strength. He paused. Now we will combine the two. He placed the locket and the button on the table in front of her. The territorial marshal is due in 2 weeks. With this evidence and your testimony, Thorn's reign in this town will be over. But a man like him, when cornered, is more dangerous than a wounded wolf. From now until the marshal arrives, one of my brothers will be in town at all times. Your safety remains our first concern. Abigail looked at the evidence, then at the 2 formidable men before her. She was no longer just a victim or a symbol. She was a player in the game. She had faced down Thorn's cruelty. Now she would help dismantle his empire. The fear she had once felt was being replaced by a cold, resolute determination. The next 2 weeks were a slow-burning fuse. The town of Redemption Gulch was a stage set for a final confrontation, and every citizen was a player whether they liked it or not. As Caleb had promised, one of the Callahan brothers was always present. They were a silent, watchful presence, their vigilance a comfort to the townsfolk, and a constant, unnerving reminder to Bartholomew Thorn that his time was running out. Levi would lean against a post outside the bakery, whittling a piece of wood, his easy smile never quite reaching his observant eyes. Isaac would help the blacksmith, his powerful arms swinging a sledgehammer in a rhythm that seemed to say, "Don't test me." Silas would disappear for hours, only to be spotted on a ridge overlooking the town, a hawk watching a field of mice. Abigail, under their protection, grew stronger each day. The physical wounds were scarring over, but the internal transformation was far more significant. She began taking her meals at the Abernathy's table, talking with the townsfolk, hearing their stories of Thorn's long-standing oppressions, land swindles, exorbitant interest rates, veiled threats. She was compiling a mental ledger of his crimes, her sharp mind connecting dots no one had ever dared to connect before. The twist, the final personal piece of the puzzle, came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abernathy was helping Abigail change the dressing on her back one afternoon. That locket, the older woman said thoughtfully. It's a terrible thing that he used it to frame that poor child. I remember when Finn Callahan bought it for Morning Song all those years ago. It was just before Caleb was born. Abigail froze. This locket belonged to the Callahan brothers' mother. Oh yes, Mrs. Abernathy said, oblivious to the gravity of her words. Finn was so proud. Morning Song rarely came to town, but when she did, she always wore it. After she passed, well, I don't know what became of it. I always assumed the boys kept it. A chill went down Abigail's spine. This changed everything. Thorn hadn't just planted a random piece of jewelry. He had used a sacred family heirloom, an object tied to the memory of the brothers' beloved mother, to frame their sister. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. This was a deep personal desecration. But how had Thorn gotten it? She asked Levi the next time he came to the clinic with supplies. She described the locket in detail. Levi's face, usually so open and charming, became a cold, hard mask. Our father buried it with her. According to Ute tradition, he said, his voice dangerously low, her grave was on the land by the creek, the same land Thorn wants. The final monstrous piece fell into place. Thorn hadn't just framed Nita. He had desecrated Morning Song's grave to get the locket. The day the territorial marshal, a formidable man named Elias Vance, was due to arrive, the tension in town was thick enough to choke on. The plan was simple. Abigail and Caleb would present the evidence and testimony to Vance, backed by the word of the other townsfolk who had finally found their courage. But cornered animals are unpredictable. Thorn knew he was finished. He saw the way the town looked at him. He saw the quiet confidence of the Callahans. His empire of fear had crumbled to dust, but he was not a man to go down without a fight. If he couldn't have the town, he would burn it down around him. Just before Marshal Vance's coach was spotted on the horizon, Thorn made his move. He didn't go after Abigail. She was too well guarded. He went for the source of his ruin. With 2 hired thugs he'd brought in from a neighboring county, he burst into the bakery. He knew the Abernathys were hiding Nita. Mr. Abernathy tried to stop him and was pistol-whipped for his trouble. Thorn grabbed the terrified Nita, dragging her out into the street. "Callahan!" He screamed, his voice raw with desperation and madness. He held a revolver to Nita's head. "You want your sister, come and get her." Isaac, who was on watch, saw it happen. He didn't charge. He let out a sharp, piercing whistle, a signal that echoed through the hills. From the ridge, Silas saw the signal and was moving before the echo faded. Levi, who was at the livery, and Jonah, who had just arrived with a supply wagon, converged on the main street. And Caleb, who had been waiting with Abigail near the doctor's office, put a hand on her arm. "Stay here." He walked out into the street, alone, his hands empty and open at his sides. He stopped 50 yards from Thorn. The whole town was watching from windows and doorways. "Let the girl go, Thorn." Caleb said, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "It's over. It's over when I say it's over." Thorn shrieked, his eyes wild. He was sweating profusely, the gun trembling in his hand. "You and your savage family and that interfering bitch have ruined me. I'm leaving this town and I'm taking the girl as insurance." "The locket, Thorn." Caleb said, his voice dropping colder still. "You took it from my mother's grave." Thorn actually laughed, a high, unhinged sound. She was dead. She didn't need it anymore. It was fitting, wasn't it? Using a piece of the mother to condemn the daughter. That was his final mistake. He had admitted his ultimate crime in front of the entire town. A gasp of horror went through the onlookers. From a second-story window of the hotel, a glint of sunlight flashed off a rifle barrel. Silas was in position. From the alley by the blacksmith, Isaac had his hand on his Colt. But Caleb held up a hand, a subtle gesture to hold their fire. This was his to finish. "There's no way out," Thorn Caleb said, taking another slow step forward. It was then that Abigail acted. She could not stand by. While all eyes were on the standoff, she slipped out the back of the clinic. She remembered her father teaching her about the strange science of sound and distraction. She circled around behind the mercantile, her heart pounding. She found a stack of empty tin cans behind the store. Just as Thorn's finger was tightening on the trigger, a tremendous crash echoed from behind the mercantile. It sounded like the entire building was collapsing. Thorn, his nerves shattered, flinched instinctively, his head jerking toward the sound for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Caleb needed. He didn't draw a gun. He moved. He covered the distance between them with a speed that was impossibly fast, a blur of motion. He hit Thorn with the force of a battering ram. The gun went flying. Nita was thrown clear. Thorn scrambled for the dropped pistol, but Caleb was on him, his hands closing around the man's throat. There was no mercy in his face, only a cold, righteous fury. It was then that the territorial marshal's coach thundered into town, skidding to a halt. Marshal Vance, a grizzled man with a large mustache and weary eyes, took in the scene in an instant, the terrified girl being scooped up by Jonah, the town's most powerful man being throttled in the dust, and 4 formidable brothers appearing from the shadows with guns drawn. Caleb Callahan, Vance's voice, boomed, "Stand down, let the law handle this." For a second, it looked as if Caleb would not obey. But then he looked at Nita, safe in Jonah's arms. He looked at Abigail now, standing on the street, watching him. He loosened his grip, hauling the gasping, spluttering Thorn to his feet and shoving him toward the marshal. "He's all yours, Marshal," Caleb said, his voice tight with contained violence. "And we have a town full of witnesses and a list of crimes that will see him hang." Thorn, broken and defeated, was clapped in irons. The standoff was over. The wolf was caged. The trial of Bartholomew Thorn was not held in a grand courthouse, but in the dusty, whiskey-scented saloon he had once owned, the long bar serving as the judge's bench for the visiting territorial marshal, Elias Vance. It was a swift and decisive affair, an autopsy of a tyrant's reign. The entire town bore witness as the dam of fear finally broke, releasing a flood of testimony. Mr. Abernathy, his face still bruised, recounted the terror of the final day. Homesteaders came forward with fraudulent land deeds. Miners spoke of a lifetime of debt peonage, their labor traded for scrip that was only valid at Thorn's own mercantile. But the keystone of the prosecution was Abigail Hayes. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the room. The scars on her back were hidden by her simple dress, but they were felt by everyone present. In a voice that was clear, calm, and devoid of malice, she recounted the events not as a victim, but as a chronicler of fact. She presented the locket returned to Caleb, but offered as evidence, and the tarnished silver button. When she spoke of how Thorn had desecrated Morning Song's grave, a collective gasp of horror sealed his fate. Thorn, caged in iron, sat shrunken and sallow, the purple rage in his face replaced by the grey pallor of defeat. He was convicted on a dozen counts, and Marshal Vance sentenced him to hang a verdict, met not with cheers, but with a solemn, exhausted silence. Vance remained in Redemption Gulch for another month, a force of federal law determined to untangle the web Thorn had spun. He spent long evenings in the doctor's office, which had become the town's de facto administrative center, poring over Thorn's meticulously coded ledgers. It was Levi Callahan with his sharp business mind, and Abigail with her educated eye for detail, who sat with him deciphering the cryptic notes and uncovering years of systematic extortion. Together they methodically voided false debts and restored stolen property titles, performing a radical surgery on the town's corrupted economy. In the wake of this cleansing, the very atmosphere of Redemption Gulch changed. The silence of fear was replaced by the sounds of rebirth. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer was no longer a sound of servitude, but of enterprise. Laughter, a sound once scarce, now spilled from the bakery. Conversations happened in the open voices, carrying with the confidence of free people. Abigail Hayes found that the anonymity she had once desperately sought had been replaced by something far more valuable purpose. One evening, standing at the window of her small room, she looked down upon the street. She saw Isaac mediating a loud dispute between two prospectors, his sheer presence calming the situation without a single threat. She saw Levi sharing a handshake and a laugh with a farmer whose ranch was now truly his own. She realized the scandal that had chased her west was a phantom from another life, a triviality compared to the flesh and blood community she had helped forge here. This place paid for with her own pain and courage was her home. She refused the Callahans' offer of a home on their ranch, insisting her place was in the town itself. With their backing, she claimed the now vacant mercantile building and transformed it into a proper schoolhouse. The shelves that once held overpriced goods were filled with books purchased with Callahan gold. On the first day, Nita, her eyes shining, was the first student through the door, her hand held tightly by a proud Jonah. Other children followed the shy offspring of homesteaders and the boisterous children of miners. Even a few Ute children, encouraged by Silas, began to attend a revolutionary step towards a shared future. Each of the brothers found a new role, their formidable skills repurposed for peace. Caleb the strategist organized the town's men and planned a sophisticated irrigation channel from the Serpentine, ensuring that no single man could ever again hold the town hostage through thirst. Isaac the brawler became the town's trusted lawman, his fierce loyalty now protecting the entire community. Levi the charmer became a vital economic engine, negotiating fair prices for the town's goods and fostering trade that benefited everyone. Silas the quiet tracker became an indispensable diplomat, his deep understanding of both worlds allowing him to build a lasting peace between the town and his Ute kin. And Jonah the gentle soul found his calling at the school, his patience and kindness making him a beloved figure to the children, often seen carving small wooden animals for them during recess. Abigail was the center of this new world. The brothers, for all their strength, would often end their days at the schoolhouse, discussing matters of the town with her. They valued her counsel, her calm logic, a necessary balance to their own more direct natures. She never married any of them. Their bond was something different, a fierce, familial respect forged in fire and sacrifice. She was their partner, their confidant, the immovable moral compass by which they all navigated. They never knelt to her again. They didn't have to. The kneeling had been a public declaration, but the respect was now a quiet daily reality. The town had been named Redemption Gulch, a moniker that had long dripped with irony. But now, under the watchful eyes of 5 brothers and the quiet guidance of the woman they revered, it had finally truly earned its name. That, my friends, is the story of Abigail Hayes and the 5 brothers who knelt to her. It's more than just a tale of the old West of dust and gunpowder. It's a testament to the fact that one person's courage can become a legend. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how much you can endure for what is right. Abigail's scars told a story not of her weakness, but of a town's redemption. These are the kinds of stories we are losing, the powerful human dramas that hide in the footnotes of history. If this story moved you, if you believe that courage and sacrifice are timeless virtues, then please help us keep these legends alive. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of true grit, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories to tell, and we want you here with us for every single one. Thank you for listening.